We begin, as we always do, with a name spoken in fear. It was the name of Silas Pruitt, president of the Millhaven Valley Bank, who stood on the porch of a modest clapboard house in the autumn of 1879 and told a grown man that his life's work now belonged to somebody else. Thomas Argent had $11 to his name after that conversation, a coat with a torn lining, and a set of hands that had shaped iron since he was 12 years old. 3 days later, at an estate auction nobody wanted to attend, held in the yard of a smithy that had sat cold and unclaimed for nearly 2 decades, he raised those same hands and bought the only thing left that anyone was willing to sell him: a rusted, half-collapsed forge, its furnace choked with soot and swallows' nests, for the sum of $3. The other bidders laughed. The auctioneer nearly refused the sale out of pity. Nobody there, not the laughing man, not the auctioneer, not even Thomas himself, had any notion that sealed inside that furnace's blackened belly was something that would take a wronged family's stolen inheritance and lay it, finally, back into the light, or that it would mend a town that had been quietly broken for 30 years. Settle in, friends, and let us tell you the story of Thomas Argent. If this is the kind of story that stays with you long after the fire burns low, we'd be grateful if you'd stay a while and let it unfold. Thomas Argent had been born in 1841 in a river town in western Pennsylvania, the third son of a wheelwright who believed, with the quiet stubbornness of poor men everywhere, that a trade honestly learned was worth more than any inheritance of coin. His father, Elias Argent, kept a small shop by the river where the barges came through, and from the time Thomas could carry a bucket, he was made to carry one: first water, then coal, then the heavier things a boy grows into without noticing the exact day his shoulders widened enough to bear them. It was not a hard childhood by the standards of that hard century, but it was a plain one, built on early mornings and late suppers and the smell of hot iron that never quite left his father's clothes even after washing. Elias did not believe in idle hands or idle talk. He believed, and said so often enough that it became a kind of scripture in that small house, that a man's worth could be read plainly in what he made and how he treated the people who could do nothing for him in return. It was this last part of his father's teaching that shaped Thomas most. He remembered, well into his own middle age, the winter a bargeman's family came through town with nothing: no coin, a wagon will split clean through, 3 children shivering under a canvas that had seen better decades, and how his father had mended that wheel through the night and refused payment, and how the bargeman had wept, actually wept, right there in the shop, from something that was not quite gratitude and not quite shame, but some older feeling that does not have a clean name. Elias had simply nodded and said that the man could pay it forward someday to some other stranger, and that would settle the account well enough. Thomas was 9 years old when he watched that exchange, and something in him fastened onto it permanently, the way a hot rivet fastens 2 plates of iron, quietly, invisibly, but for good. He apprenticed formally at 14, not to his father, who believed a son ought to learn discipline from someone who owed him no natural affection, but to a hard, fair, silent smith 2 towns over named Garrett Voss, a man who had fought in no wars and buried 2 wives, and spoke perhaps 40 words in an average day, most of them corrections. From Voss, Thomas learned the deeper grammar of the trade, not merely how to shape iron, but how to listen to it, how a piece of metal announced its own readiness by the color of its glow and the particular ring it gave under the hammer, how patience was not the absence of urgency, but the discipline of waiting until the material itself was ready to be changed. Voss used to say that any fool could beat hot iron into a shape. The skill was in knowing when to stop beating it and let the iron become what it already wanted to become. Thomas did not fully understand this teaching as a boy. He understood it, later, as a grown man standing before a mystery far larger than any horseshoe or plow blade, and by then it had become the whole shape of his character. He married at 23, a schoolteacher's daughter named Mary Ellison, a woman with a steadiness that matched his own and a habit of keeping careful records, of the household accounts, of letters received, of small kindnesses done and owed, that would prove, in ways neither of them could have imagined on their wedding day, to be exactly the kind of mind their family would need decades later. They moved west together in 1868, following the promise that so many families followed in those years, the promise that land and opportunity lay past the next range of hills for anyone willing to work honestly for it. They settled first in Nebraska, then, after a hard winter that took their first child before her second birthday, moved on to the Colorado Territory, to a young settlement called Millhaven Creek that had grown up around a silver strike and a stubborn optimism that the strike would last. Thomas opened a smithy there in 1871. He built it himself, board by board, on a modest lot at the edge of town near the creek that gave the settlement its name, and for 8 years it was, by every measure that mattered to him, a good and honest life. He shod horses and mended wagons and forged tools for the miners and the ranchers alike, charged fair prices, extended credit to families who needed it, and never pressed too hard for repayment, and raised, with Mary, 2 more children who lived and thrived. He was, in the plain language his father would have used, a man whose worth could be read in what he made. It was the drought of 1877 that began the unraveling, though no single event ever announces itself at the time as the beginning of a family's ruin. Ruin, when we look back honestly at it, is almost always a slow accumulation of small failures rather than one dramatic blow. The rains simply did not come that spring, nor the following one, and the ranchers who owed Thomas for shoeing and repairs found their own herds thinned and their own accounts empty. And a man cannot easily collect a fair debt from a neighbor who has nothing left to give without becoming the kind of man his own father raised him not to be. Thomas extended more credit rather than less. He told himself, as many honest men have told themselves in hard seasons, that the rains would return and the accounts would settle themselves in time, and that a smith who turned away a struggling neighbor was no smith worth the name his father gave him. What Thomas did not fully reckon with, what few working men in that era fully reckoned with, until it was too late, was the particular danger of the Millhaven Valley Bank and its president, Silas Pruitt. Pruitt had come to the territory some years after Thomas, a smooth, well-dressed man from back east who had built the bank on borrowed capital and a genuine talent for appearing generous precisely when he was being most calculating. He extended loans freely to struggling tradesmen during the drought years, loans with terms that seemed reasonable on the page and were murder in the fine print, and Thomas, needing capital to keep his own credit extended to his neighbors, signed 2 such loans in 1878 without reading them as closely as his wife had begged him to. Mary had wanted to go over the papers herself. She had, after all, kept every ledger the family ever needed. Thomas, proud in the particular way that hard-working men are sometimes proud, had told her not to trouble herself, that he understood the terms well enough. It was the one significant misjudgment of his working life, and it cost him everything. By the autumn of 1879, with the drought still unbroken and a note come due that Thomas could not meet, Silas Pruitt foreclosed on the smithy, the tools, and the modest house behind it, all in one clean stroke of a pen, executed with the same smooth courtesy he had used to extend the original loan. He stood on Thomas's porch himself to deliver the news, which some men in town later said was either a small mercy or a small cruelty, depending on how you read a banker's motives. And he used the word regrettable 3 times in the space of 2 minutes while a deputy nailed a notice to the smithy door. Mary did not weep in front of Pruitt. She waited until he had ridden off before she allowed herself that, and even then only for a short while, before she set about the work of figuring out where the family would sleep and how the children would eat, because that was the kind of woman she was, the kind who kept the ledgers and did not let grief interrupt necessity for longer than it had to. They took a single room above a mercantile on the far end of town, the 4 of them, and Thomas spent 3 days walking Millhaven Creek and the surrounding country in a state he did not have a name for, something heavier than shame and quieter than despair, a numbness that comes to a man who has always been able to point to something he made with his own hands and suddenly has nothing at all to point to. It was on the 3rd day, wandering out past the edge of town toward a stand of cottonwoods along an old wagon road, that he came upon a weathered notice tacked to a fence post advertising an estate auction, the effects, tools, and property of one Josiah Webb, deceased smith, to be sold to settle an estate that had apparently sat unclaimed and untouched for the better part of 18 years. Nobody in Millhaven Creek spoke much of Josiah Webb. and what little Thomas had heard in 8 years of living there was fragmentary and secondhand. That he had been a free blacksmith who arrived in the territory sometime before the town itself properly existed. That he had kept largely to himself out past the creek's bend. That he had been well regarded by those who used his services and viewed with suspicion or worse by others. And that he had died alone sometime in the early 1860s under circumstances nobody seemed eager to discuss in detail. His smithy had simply stood empty ever since. The ownership tangled in some dispute nobody had bothered to resolve, until now, when the county had apparently decided the land was worth more cleared than left to rot. The auction, when Thomas arrived at it 2 days later with nearly the last of his $11 folded into his coat pocket, was a threadbare and mocking little affair. A handful of men had come mostly out of curiosity or the hope of picking up scrap iron cheap, and the auctioneer, a bored county clerk named Pomeroy, moved through what remained of Josiah Webb's life with the flat efficiency of a man closing out an obligation rather than honoring a memory. There was little enough to sell: some rusted hand tools, a collapsed lean-to, a length of chain, and, largest and least wanted of all, the forge itself, a great iron and brick furnace structure sunk half into the earth, its bellows rotted to leather scraps, its stack choked with 2 decades of nesting birds and wind-blown debris, tilted slightly on its foundation as though the whole structure were tired and wished to lie down. Men laughed when Pomeroy called for bids on it. One remarked, loud enough for the yard to hear, that you couldn't give the thing away, let alone sell it, and that whoever bought it was buying a headache and nothing else. It was in the wake of that laughter, standing at the edge of the small crowd with his hat in his hands and nothing left in the world but a trade he could not currently practice, that Thomas Argent heard himself say $3, and heard the words leave his mouth before he had entirely decided to speak them, the way a man sometimes discovers his own decision only in the act of announcing it. Nobody bid against him. Pomeroy shrugged, took the coin, and the forge belonged to Thomas Argent before the sun had moved another hand's width across the sky. Mary did not scold him when he told her that evening what he had done with 3 of their last $11. Though her silence carried its own particular weight, the silence of a woman doing arithmetic she does not like the results of. But she also did not forbid him from walking out to the old Webb property the following morning. And so he went alone, at first light, with a crowbar and a coil of rope and the stubborn, half-embarrassed hope of a man who has nothing better to do with his hands than try to make something useful out of what everyone else has already called worthless. The furnace was worse up close than it had appeared at auction. The brickwork was crumbling on the eastern face, the iron hearth plate was rusted through in 2 places, and something had clearly nested and died inside the flue at some point in the intervening years, judging by the smell that rolled out when he first worked the ash door free. Thomas spent the better part of that first morning simply clearing debris, dead leaves gone to black paste, splintered lath, the brittle bones of birds, a queer accumulation of small stones that he took at first for nothing more than the random deposits of years, before his crowbar, working at a section of the interior hearth wall that seemed looser than the brick around it, struck something that did not sound like brick at all. It rang, faint but unmistakable, with the particular hollow note of struck iron. He worked more carefully after that, setting the crowbar aside in favor of his hands and a smaller chisel, and within the hour he had exposed what appeared to be a false interior wall at the rear of the furnace's firebox, built of iron plate rather than brick and fitted with a craftsman's precision that had nothing accidental about it. A seam so tight and so deliberately concealed behind a course of ordinary-looking bricks that it had survived nearly 2 decades of weather and neglect without ever being noticed. His pulse, he would later admit, was doing something it had not done in the whole numb week since Pruitt's visit to his porch. He pried the plate loose with a care that surprised him, given how little he had left to lose, and behind it, set into a shallow recess in the furnace's stone foundation, sat a lead-lined box no larger than a family Bible, sealed with wax gone brittle and yellow with age. Thomas carried that box home wrapped in his own coat, walking the whole distance back to the room above the mercantile with the particular careful gait of a man who suspects, without yet knowing why, that he is carrying something that matters. Mary was the one who finally broke the wax seal, at the kitchen table that evening, with the children asleep in the next room and a single lamp burning low. And it was Mary's steady, ledger-keeping hands that lifted out, one by one, the objects Josiah Webb had hidden inside the furnace of his own forge some 2 decades before his death. A modest but genuine quantity of gold coin, some 40 ounces in all, wrapped in oiled cloth. A hand-bound ledger filled with careful entries in a precise, educated script, and a bundle of letters, several dated and several not, tied together with a cord that had gone stiff with age. The ledger was the first thing that told them this was no ordinary buried treasure of the kind men whispered about in every territory town. It was a record, kept over years, of names, dozens of names, first names only in most cases, sometimes with a location or a date beside them, alongside small sums of money and brief, coded notations that Thomas did not immediately understand, but that Mary, reading more carefully by lamplight, began to recognize for what they almost certainly were, a record of a station, one of many scattered secretly across the country in the years before the war, through which Josiah Webb had helped move people fleeing slavery north toward freedom, using his trade as a smith, a trade that let him travel between towns and forge tools and wagon fittings without suspicion, as both his livelihood and his cover. The letters, read together over the course of that long night and several nights that followed, filled in what the ledger's spare notations could not. Josiah Webb, it emerged, had been born free in Ohio, but had spent the better part of his young manhood helping others reach the freedom he had been born into, working alongside a loose and dangerous network of smiths, teamsters, and preachers who moved people north by wagon, by forge repair pretext, by whatever quiet means presented themselves. He had come west after the war not merely to seek his fortune in Silver Country, but because a number of the families he had helped along that route had themselves eventually made their way west as well, and Webb had intended. The letters made this explicit, in a hand that grew more urgent and more careful in its final years, to use the gold he had been entrusted with. Contributions gathered from grateful families and sympathetic supporters over more than a decade to purchase and hold land near Millhaven Creek in trust, land on which those families and their descendants could settle freely and securely, with clear title that no one could later dispute or seize. The last letter in the bundle, dated only months before what the county records suggested was Webb's death, was addressed to no one by name, written instead as though intended for whoever might one day find it, and it explained, in a voice Thomas found himself reading aloud to Mary with a thickness in his throat he had not expected, that Webb had grown afraid that certain men in the growing settlement had begun asking pointed questions about a blacksmith with unexplained means, afraid that the land he had quietly begun purchasing under a trusted intermediary's name was being watched, afraid that he might not live to see the trust properly established. He had hidden the gold and the ledger and the deed papers, the letter explained, inside the one place he trusted absolutely, the furnace of his own forge, built by his own hands, in the hope that if anything happened to him, an honest smith would one day find it and understand what it meant. The land itself, the letter noted, had been purchased under the name of a white intermediary Webb trusted, a surveyor named Caleb Pruitt, and it was on reading that single name, Pruitt, that Thomas Argent felt the whole shape of the mystery shift beneath him like ground giving way. It took the better part of 2 weeks of careful, discreet inquiry, conducted mostly by Mary, who had a schoolteacher's patience for old records and a natural gift for asking questions that did not sound like questions, before the fuller shape of the deception became clear. Caleb Pruitt, it turned out, was Silas Pruitt's own father, dead now some 15 years, who had indeed purchased a substantial tract of land along Millhaven Creek in 1861 under an arrangement with Josiah Webb, land that was meant, by the terms Webb's letters described, to be held in trust and eventually transferred into the names of the families it was intended to shelter. Caleb Pruitt had never transferred so much as an acre. Whether he had intended from the start to betray that trust, or whether Webb's death and the chaos of the war years had simply presented him with an opportunity too tempting for a man of loose scruples to resist, Thomas could not say with certainty and never claimed to. What was beyond dispute, once Mary had traced the county's own recorded deeds back far enough, was that the land Caleb Pruitt quietly acquired and eventually willed to his son Silas included not merely the tract meant for Webb's trust, but, through a boundary redrawn sometime in the following decade under circumstances the county clerk's older records described only vaguely, a significant portion of what was now the heart of downtown Millhaven Creek itself, including, though Thomas did not discover this detail until later and found it bitterly fitting when he did, the very lot on which the Millhaven Valley Bank now stood. Word of a man asking questions about old land titles travels quickly in a small territory town, and it was perhaps 10 days after Thomas first pried the iron plate loose from Josiah Webb's furnace that Silas Pruitt appeared, unannounced and considerably less smooth than his usual manner, at the room above the mercantile where the Argent family now lived. He did not raise his voice. Men like Pruitt rarely needed to. He spoke instead in the same courteous, regretful tone he had used on Thomas's own porch weeks before, suggesting that whatever old papers Thomas believed he had found were almost certainly worthless, that the estate of a man 40 years dead held no legal claim over land properly recorded and improved in good faith by the Pruitt family for a generation, and that a man in Thomas's current circumstances, homeless, indebted, with a family depending on him, would do well to consider that pursuing such matters publicly could only bring him further difficulty that a bank president had considerable means to arrange. It was not quite a threat. It was close enough to one that Mary asked him to leave before Thomas had to. The following weeks were the hardest of the ordeal, harder in their way than the foreclosure itself, because now Thomas understood what was truly at stake and felt the full weight of not knowing whether he could do anything honest with that knowledge. Pruitt moved quickly and quietly to discredit him around town, letting it be known through the particular gossip channels a banker has ready access to that the disgraced former Smith was making wild and possibly deranged claims about buried treasure and old slave records, the sort of talk Pruitt's allies suggested with practiced sympathy that a man sometimes falls into when ruin has unsettled his mind. Several old customers who had once trusted Thomas's word without question now regarded him on the street with the particular careful politeness reserved for a man people have decided to feel sorry for rather than believe. It would have been easy, in those weeks, for Thomas to simply take the gold Josiah Webb had left behind, quietly leave Millhaven Creek, and start over somewhere his name carried no shadow. And Mary, ever practical, raised the possibility once, gently, not because she wanted it, but because she wanted him to have chosen otherwise with his eyes open. Thomas chose otherwise for reasons that traced back, in the end, to a winter morning decades before, to a bargeman weeping over a mended wheel he could not pay for, and to his father's plain insistence that a man's worth is read in what he does for people who can do nothing for him in return. Josiah Webb had built that hidden chamber and hidden that gold not for himself, but for people he would very likely never meet, families whose freedom he had already helped secure and whose future security he had tried, with his own hands and his own trade, to build into the very stones of his forge. To take that gold now for his own family's comfort, however desperately his family needed comfort, would have been to finish the betrayal Caleb Pruitt began rather than to redeem it. So instead, Thomas and Mary spent those weeks building their case with the same patient, methodical care Mary applied to any ledger. They tracked down, through letters sent to towns as far as Kansas and Ohio, several living descendants of the families named in Josiah Webb's ledger, families who still held their own fragments of the story. A grandmother's recollection of a Smith who had helped her mother's family cross into free territory. A preserved letter thanking a Mr. Webb for kindnesses that had made a new life possible. They secured, through a sympathetic and semi-retired territorial judge named Harmon Reyes, a man old enough to remember the pre-war years and unimpressed enough by Silas Pruitt's standing to actually examine the county's oldest deed books rather than take the bank's version of history on faith, a formal hearing into the disputed title. And they brought, on the day of that hearing, held in the modest territorial courthouse before a gallery that included nearly half the town, the ledger, the letters, and the sworn testimony of two of Josiah Webb's own surviving beneficiaries, elderly now but sharp-minded, who had traveled a considerable distance at their own expense to say, in open court, Exactly what Josiah Webb had done for their families, and exactly what he had intended that gold and that land to become. Silas Pruitt fought it as far as a man of his particular character always fights such things, with lawyers, with procedural objections, with a wounded, aggrieved insistence that his family's good name was being slandered by the ravings of a bankrupt Smith and a dead man's forged papers. But Josiah Webb's script matched, letter for letter, samples the county clerk located in old business filings from the correct period, and the original 1861 purchase agreement, once Judge Reyes had it properly examined, contained trust language that even Pruitt's own lawyer struggled to argue away. The judge's ruling, delivered on a bright, cold morning in the early spring of 1880, did not strip Silas Pruitt of everything. The town itself, the judge noted, could not be unbuilt, and 30 years of honest improvement by innocent third parties could not simply be erased by a single deed. But it restored to the trust, and through it to Josiah Webb's living beneficiaries and their descendants, a meaningful tract of the original land along the creek, established a public accounting of how the rest had been acquired, and, in the detail that seemed to strike the packed courtroom hardest, judging by the low murmur that ran through it, ordered the bank to pay into a community fund, administered by an independent board rather than by Pruitt himself, a sum reflecting years of unjust enrichment from land that was never rightfully his to hold alone. Thomas took not $1 of Josiah Webb's gold for himself. He placed all 40 ounces of it, along with his own labor freely given, into rebuilding what the ruling had restored, a proper deeded settlement along the creek for Webb's beneficiaries. And at the center of it, standing on the very ground where the old forge had crumbled for 2 decades unremembered, a rebuilt smithy, sound roof, sound bellows, a repaired furnace with its hidden chamber left open now rather than sealed, as a kind of memorial nobody in town needed explained to them once they understood the story. Thomas ran that forge himself, the same trade his father had taught him on a Pennsylvania riverbank, the same patient listening for the moment iron announces its own readiness that Garrett Voss had drilled into him as a boy. And within a year the townspeople who had once regarded him with pitying suspicion were bringing him their tools and their horses and their trust again. Not because a court had vindicated him, but because he had shown them, plainly, in what he made and how he treated people, who could do nothing for him in return, exactly the kind of man he was. We began this story with a man standing foolish and desperate at a country auction, $3 in his outstretched palm for a rusted, sinking furnace that every other man in that yard had already laughed off as worthless. We told you then that something sealed inside it would change his life and restore a community, and we did not tell you what, because some things are better discovered the way Thomas Argent discovered them himself, slowly, with his own hands, in the dark, not knowing yet what he had found. What he found, in the end, was not merely gold, though gold was part of it, and not merely a wrong righted, though that mattered a great deal to the families who finally received land that had been theirs by right for 3 generations. What he found, we think, was the same lesson his own father had tried to teach him on a riverbank 40 years earlier, carried forward by a stranger he never met and preserved, of all places, in the one part of a forge that fire cannot touch without being fed and tended by a patient hand. That worth is not always visible on the surface of a thing. That some of the most valuable inheritances in this world are the ones somebody else thought too rusted, too broken, too worthless to keep. Thomas Argent bought a ruin for $3 and became, in restoring it honestly to the people it was always meant for, exactly the kind of man his name had once again come to mean something. Thank you for spending this time with us and with Thomas Argent's story. If it moved you, we'd be grateful if you'd share it with someone who might need a little reminder that overlooked things can still hold quiet worth, and that patient, honest hands can still set old wrongs right. We'd love to know, in your own words below, what is a time you found real value in something everyone else had already written off? Until next time, stay close.